Okay, wonderful. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We are so excited to be here and talking to you all a little bit about the role of social emotional learning in special education. As I just mentioned, for anyone who may have missed the message, we are recording today's discussion, which is really great. We're going to be disseminating this resource to other members of our community who weren't able to join us here today. Just a quick tidbit on our end. This discussion is meant to be educational in nature, to serve as a resource for you. If you have specific questions pertaining to your child, and I assume from both a behavioral and a legal perspective, Michael, jump in here if you have anything to add, but please know that, this is not meant to be construed as individual advice. So if you have questions particular to your case, please reach out to your specific advisors, your specific behavior analysts for individualized advice, because this is an educational tool. So just a little disclaimer there.
I agree, Megan.
Yep, go ahead.
Be specific to any one child. So again, don't take this advice as if you need advice for your child specifically, feel free to reach out to myself or Megan. Our info should be there, and we will also, you can find us on our website, but we will be talking in more general terms. And of course, as an attorney, I must always say every case is unique, and there's no rules that apply to every case.
Absolutely. Thank you for stating that much more eloquently than I just did, Michael. I needed a little backup there. But so to kind of frame our discussion today, first we're going to just quickly introduce ourselves, and then we'll dive into some topics we had selected that we thought might be helpful for our community. So my name is Meghan Cave. I probably should have said that from the start, but I am the co-founder and co-CEO of the Hangout Spot LLC, which is a social skills development center where we use the science of applied behavior analysis, which is the science of learning and behavior, to teach all things play and social. So we work with kids ages birth to 18, and we do take some young adult cases on a case-by-case basis. We use play, passion, and interest as a modality to teach kids all of the skills that they need to be successful in developing meaningful relationships with other people. So at the very foundation, that includes play skills all the way up to things like, how do I have conversation? How do I respond to teasing? How do I utilize social media in a way that's going to be effective? All with the ultimate intention of teaching kids how to have meaningful reciprocal relationships with other people. Michael, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and your practice?
Sure. Thank you, Megan. Again, my name is Michael Gilberg. I'm a special education attorney representing children with disabilities in special education proceedings whose parents either disagree with the services, believe the child should be identified for special education and are not getting services, believe the child needs an out-of-district placement. Any disputes with the school district that involve an attorney needed to change the services, more services, different services. As well, I grew up with undiagnosed Asperger's syndrome, so I come from it as a perspective of a self-advocate, and in particular, compared to other special education attorneys, I really focus on the social emotional needs of the child. Very often, as I always say, schools believe special education is all about academics and say, well, his grades are good, but don't look at the social emotional piece of learning, which was a challenge I had growing up and many children on the autism spectrum and other disabilities experience today.
Great, thanks, Michael. So you guys, we love meaningful discussion. Michael and I jump on Zoom every few months and have some of the greatest discussion. So we want this to be meaningful for you. We want you to walk away from today with a few tidbits that you can apply to your child's own social experiences or own educational experiences. So please, at any point, if you have questions, you have comments, I will be monitoring the chat feature, so feel free to go ahead and throw them in there so that we can answer any questions you might have and make this a really interactive, meaningful experience for you all. So we are going to be touching on a few different points today. I've kind of outlined them here for you. We're going to be addressing these discussion points from both a behavioral perspective in accordance with the principles of applied behavior analysis. And then Michael's going to give you his really incredible insight from a legal perspective as well as his personal experiences. So I think the first thing we really wanted to touch on here, Michael, was who would benefit from social learning experiences. And I'll kind of start, and then I'll toss it over your way if that works for you to give.
Would be great.
Okay, wonderful. So from our perspective here at the Hangout Spot, I always make the joke that, here I am, I'm 30 years old, and there are so many things that I could do better when it comes to how I interact with other people. And that's one of our guiding principles here, is that we could all stand to benefit from social emotional learning, even as a 30-year-old adult, because there are always things we can do to improve our relationships with other people. So at the Hangout Spot, we don't necessarily, we don't believe that, social skills instruction is only important for individuals with a diagnosed disability. We don't necessarily believe that social skills instruction is only important for children who are struggling to make friends. We believe that there's always something we can all do to improve our social relationships with other people. The other thing that I think is really important to note here is that we don't believe that there are any prerequisite skills required to access social skills instruction. Because you guys, from the very moment we're born, we rely upon our ability to relate to other people to literally survive. So if you think about a newborn infant, they engage in a whole series of different behaviors like crying, shifting eye gaze to figures in their space, all for the purpose of literally surviving, right? So they use their behaviors to engage in relationships from the very moment they're born. So given that, we believe there are absolutely no prerequisite skills required to access social skills instruction. So many times we hear things, particularly, when we're working with school-based teams, of things like, this child doesn't have a verbal communication system, and so therefore they're not ready for social skills instruction. Well, I would argue, if you've ever had laryngitis, let's go with that example, right? And you lose your voice. Do you all of a sudden lose all your social skills? Do you all of a sudden become completely, that social interactions are no longer important to you simply because you have laryngitis and you can't speak? Well, absolutely not. In fact, I would say that now all of a sudden social skills are even more important to you than they were before, because now you are reliant on all of the other things that go into social interaction other than your voice to interact with other people. So again, our ultimate value system here is that we believe that all of us are able to improve the way we interact with other people, even those of us who are adults, who are no longer in school, who may or may not have an identified disability. We could all stand to improve, and there are no prerequisites required to improve your relationships with other people and access that instruction. Michael, I know you have some really awesome perspective on this in terms of thinking through this question and some tidbits on your end. So go ahead, I'll pass it to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Megan. And I think the first thing I want to emphasize, because a lot of people in the autism self-advocate community, and I've discussed this with Megan as a BCBA, believe that ABA is evil and that all ABA is bad. And I always explain to people that you need to understand first that behavior analysis and behavior modification all depends on what the behavior is and how it's done. Not all, and I'm sure Megan would agree with this, not all behavior modification is done with what are called aversive, which are negative consequences. Megan and I have discussed this many times, and I also believe that we have to look at what the behavior is. As I always explain to people, a child flapping his hands because it releases anxiety and stimming that doesn't harm anyone is a behavior that we don't need to eliminate because it's not hurting anyone. But a child who's hitting other students or running in the street, and I've seen many cases of those, these are behaviors we obviously have to eliminate because they're dangerous to the child, they're dangerous to others. Too many young children on the spectrum are known for running in the street, or running towards the street rather, and that's a behavior that has to be modified or eliminated because the consequences are too serious to not address it. That being said, I think that behavior modification and behavior analysis needs to be looked at in terms of what the behavior is and what the function of the behavior is, and also how it's being done. That being said, there were, as Megan said, we're all learning social skills and we're all behavior modified in some way throughout our lives, whether we're disabled or not, whether we're children or adults. You know, if I touch a burner on the stove, I'm going to get behavior modification because I'm going to burn my hand. If I cross the street with a red light and get hit by a car, that's going to affect my behavior, assuming I survive. So we all are modified and conditioned to follow certain stimuli and behavior to begin with. But Megan is correct also in what she said. Social skills are a very big part of the world. And, you know, we'll talk about COVID in a minute, but we're living in a very interesting time given everything going on with human interaction. There's a common mistake that people on the autism spectrum, autistic people rather, most people prefer the term autistic people, don't want social interaction, when the truth is most of us crave friendships and the same social relationships as everyone else. It's a matter of, and it's a wide spectrum of people. Like a lot of people with autism do not understand necessarily how to interact appropriately or what are the social norms of society. And one of the big things I've always emphasized in schools is, and this is also covered under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is a federal law governing special education. Special ed, as I said before, is not just academics. You could have a student with straight A and honors and has no social skills. The school has an obligation to teach that kid appropriate social skills and how to interact with peers and how, because you need to be able to function in the society, not just knowing what you need to know academically and intellectually, but also behaviorally. You know, you can have a bright student, but if he thinks it's okay to hit his classmates, that's obviously a problem.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so Michael started to touch a little bit on our bullet point here about prioritizing skills for instruction. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into that concept. So all of the things Michael just talked about in the world of applied behavior analysis, we use the term socially significant. So what that means in layman's terms is what change can I make in somebody's life that is going to make a monumental difference? Okay, so there are certain skills when we think about social skills and the whole spectrum of social skills. So here at the Hangout spot, we think about play as the foundation of social learning. So at its very early stages, it's things like, hey, do I shift eye gaze to another person when they walk into a room? Or do I engage in cause and effect actions to activate some kind of a toy? All the way up to things like, do I send a text message in a way that's going to get a positive response from my peers? Do I engage in back and forth conversation with other people? So the spectrum of skills that we could teach a child is monumental. I mean, totally monumental. There are probably thousands, gosh, that might even be an underestimate, of skills that comprise social emotional learning. And as behavior analysts, we have to really think critically about this. And as teachers, right? So beyond just the world of applied behavior analysis, but as teachers or parents, if we had to spend time, and we know how long it can take our kids to learn certain skills to mastery, if we had to spend time teaching our children each social skill individually in isolation, well, gosh, we might be here forever, right? To even teach a child who doesn't struggle from a social perspective every single skill individually, that could take a really, really long time. And there's a better way to do that. So we think about A, what's going to be socially significant? What skill can I teach that's going to make the biggest difference? And B, we think about something called behavioral costs. So behavioral costs are skills that you can teach that all of a sudden expand a child's world of learning immediately, simply by getting that one skill. So you get a lot more bang for your buck. The most common example I think of is motor imitation. So if we have a little guy who's learning sort of in one of our developmental playgroup models, and we can teach that child how to engage in motor imitation, which is literally, I do something with my body, you do something with your body. You copy it, right? If I can teach that skill, all of a sudden, guys, the way kids learn is through imitating other people's behaviors. All kids learn that way, right? They see other kids doing things. They see mom and dad doing things. doing things. They see people in the community or on the playground doing things. So they start to do them too. And if I can teach a child motor imitation, now all of a sudden their world has expanded. If I can teach a child how to crawl, all of a sudden their world has expanded because now they can independently explore their social environment and they're not relying on an adult to bring things to them. So those are two little kid examples, but there are examples, many, many, many examples for our older kids too, and cusps all along the developmental trajectory. And so, certainly I think to Michael's point, we have to think about what are the priority skills. We're not looking to change personalities. We're not looking to create these little robots who are perfect social beings, right? That's not what we're all about. We embrace individuality. We embrace kids' passions, kids' preferences, kids' quirks, and we build upon those. But we think about what is it that would help this child have the most joyful, meaningful life experience when it comes to their relationships with other people? And what can we do to maximize development so that we don't have to teach each thing independently, and we can kind of accelerate that progress? Michael, anything you'd like to add there in terms of prioritizing skills?
Sure, thank you, Megan. I think, as Megan said, it's about not changing who people are. This has always been a conversation in the autism community of the idea that you don't want ABA to remove your individuality or make you, as the people like to say, indistinguishable from neurotypical people. But again, as Megan said, we have to remove behaviors that are maladaptive. Again, my example, the kid running in the street. I once had a client who thought he could go out the second floor window of his house, and clearly that was a skill he had to learn. It wasn't a matter of changing him, it was a matter of his own safety, that you can't go out a second floor window safely.
Yeah, definitely. So, and I think on the flip side, just to add one more point there, there's this idea of decreasing barriers, and we see this a lot when we're talking about social learning, right? So I want to decrease some of these maladaptive behaviors that are really preventing my child from making friends or being a member of his classroom or getting a job or dating, right? There's all of those different domains of it. It's also about teaching the new skills, right? So it's great and wonderful to teach kids, I love your example, Michael, right? Not to run into the middle of the road. But we also, on the flip side of that, have to teach them what to do instead, So what are they running away from? Why are they running into the road? To give a more, a different kind of example, if a child is frequently engaging in, let's say, very large responses to teasing, so they might cry, they might yell back, they might, a whole host of different things. What do we teach them to do instead? We teach them how to make a short verbal comeback. We teach them to act like it's no big deal. We teach them to ask adults for help when they need it. So there's this element of decreasing barriers. There's also this element of teaching appropriate replacement behaviors. And one only works if the other one happens at the same time. So that's something to think about as well as you think through what skills am I teaching? What barriers do I need to decrease, but what skills do I also need to teach that are going to serve as appropriate replacement behaviors? To get to our next point about using evidence-based programs. So there are so many social skills curriculum out there, and I'm sure you guys have heard some of them. There are many, many great tools. We recognize that there is not going to be one program that is going to be a perfect fit for every child. And there are likely elements from many different curriculum that would be meaningful for each child or each individual. Now, that being said, applied behavior analysis is the science of learning and behavior. It's simply the principles that all living beings learn from. So, Michael, you gave the best example ever of, if I touch a stove, I'm going to learn something really quick that I probably shouldn't touch that stove again because it's hot, right? And that is applied behavior analysis right there. It's behaviorism. Go ahead, Michael.
Obviously, at 43, I've already learned that lesson, but this is a lesson many children learn, whether autistic or neurotypical, very quickly.
Yep, because it's how the environment changes our behavior. It's just, that's the way people learn, right? So yes, that's absolutely.
This is not modification by a human. This is modification by an electric device.
Exactly, and there's so many examples of that. And The idea is that we need to use the principles of learning, which simply like we just discussed, to teach skills. Evidence-based programming needs to be at the core of any social skills program. So one of the things we really value here at the Hangout Spot is, we don't do script memorization. We do not drill and kill rules. We do not have kids sit at a table and recite the rules back test, because then what we get is a child who's really, really good at telling me all the rules of social interaction, but cannot apply those rules contextually in real life where it really matters. Because at the end of the day, it's great and wonderful if you can do it with me in this room in a super structured setting with a couple kids. But if you can't go to the prom and do it, and you can't go to a hangout and do it, and you can't go to your classroom and do it, or a play date or the playground, then I haven't done my job. So the way we do that is through evidence-based programming using natural environment teaching. This is incredibly critical if you are thinking about social skills programming for your child in the school setting. We do not drill and kill rules. We do not do script memorization. We use natural environment teaching to teach kids contextually in real life. We teach in the moment. We use the principles of learning. We build upon passions. We build upon interests, and we embed learning in play and in what kids like to do, because that increases the likelihood of generalization to the real world. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a child who can tell you the rules but not contextually apply them. I'm super passionate about this topic, if you couldn't tell. So if you would like to learn more about this, I'm not going to bore you with all my technical scientific details, but I am happy to share more about this and talk through that. But we can use curriculums combined with the principles of applied behavior analysis and natural environment teaching, and that's how you get a really high quality program. Go ahead, Michael. I'll toss it over to you for any of that.
Again, and one thing I wanted to mention when we talk about evidence-based programming that's been an issue in the autism community and among self-advocates is the notion of aversive. And as Meghan was saying, her practice and others use naturalistic settings in real life where you don't have to use aversives to teach children behavior. Aversives are considered negative consequences. And yes, children get taught by aversives all the time. Parents spank their kids when they do something wrong. The example with the stove was an aversive, not from a human, but from a device. And so I always explain to people that the extreme cases, for those who haven't heard, it's the Judge Rottenberg Center in Massachusetts, which uses electric shock therapy on students, which uses the deprivation of food as a punishment. And these things do not work. These are not evidence-based. These are purely punitive, and they don't teach appropriate behaviors and appropriate replacement skills. And what Meghan's talking about with evidence-based practices, you don't want to punish children. You want to teach them appropriate skills and appropriate replacement behaviors. And that is usually can be done through positive reinforcement, not a need through negative reinforcement. We don't tell a child who's caught running in the street, we don't teach him by letting him get hit by a car until he learns not to do it. That would be both dangerous and not productive, obviously. So the goal is to try to eliminate aversive and negative consequences, whereas we replace the behaviors with positive behaviors.
Absolutely. Yeah, so then kind of diving a little bit deeper. So now we've got an evidence-based program, right? We know what that looks like. We've got some ideas there. Then what? So this piece is often forgotten. I think that when we're providing social skills instruction, it is critically important to define objectives in a way that is measurable. Social skills are fluffy, guys. They're fluffy, they're hard to define, and that can make them really hard to measure. And so then as a result, and Michael will be able to speak more to this in a moment, but as a result, we get people's opinions, right? So you might get an annual review report with a whole paragraph about people's opinions of what a child can and cannot do. And then we get messy looking data that's not that helpful. When in reality, if we define objectives using really measurable language, we are able to collect data on a child's actual performance in real life and rely upon that data to determine if we're making progress. So here at the Hangout Spot, all of our kids have defined goals and objectives. They're written in really measurable ways. So things like we have objectives for so-and-so will ask a peer for information he or she needs to win a game. So-and-so will ask a peer to take a turn when they forget to take a turn in a game. so-and-so will provide a rationale for their opinion during conversation, or join a conversation by mentioning a common interest and then saying a question or a comment to continue the conversation. So you can see how I take something as fluffy and complicated as conversation and break it down into, I mean, gosh, there's probably hundreds of skills that make up conversation, from mentioning a common interest to making a comment or question, to checking for signs of interest from your communication partner, to then continuing to make comments and questions, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to list them all. But the idea is we define those things objectively. Then we can take data. Then we can see if the child is making progress. And our motto here is, if the child isn't making progress, we are not doing something right. And we, as the educators, have to change what we are doing to help empower that child to master that skill. One important piece of information I want to mention here, you guys, kids don't need to be perfect. We all make mistakes. We make mistakes in our relationships with our spouses, with our friends, with our colleagues. We all do it, right? Nobody is perfect. And so when we're thinking about social performance, we're not looking for perfect. We're not, right? We're looking for age appropriate. So not for nothing, but 5-year-olds, they use potty language. And so many times we see people trying to throw potty language out the door and get kids to stop using potty language. Well, guess what? Using potty language is the key to social success when you're in kindergarten. If you can't do that, it's going to be really hard to make friends. And if we get rid of potty language in and of itself, well, we've just set up a child for social failure. Gossip is another one of those. Now, certainly there's a line, right? There's a line of what represents age-appropriate gossip and what's a little bit much. But if you teach a child to never gossip, they're going to have a really hard time fitting in with friends at school, because a certain level of that is socially successful. A certain level of it isn't, right? But we're not looking for perfect. We're looking for that just right amount of the skill. You can only figure out if you're at that point if you're collecting data. And I think Michael will probably touch on this in a second, but you can only have discussions with your school team about whether or not a child is making social progress if you have data. And so data plays a really big role in everything we do here in terms of making decisions about programming and thinking through next steps for kids. Go ahead, Michael, take it away.
As Megan said, the data is very important. My job as an attorney is to go to a school district and advocate for why this child needs different services, more services, a change in services. And without demonstrable data, it's very hard to make that case. A school district, you know, I can tell a school district they're wrong, but if I don't have the data, they're not going to listen to me.
Right.
And you need that data. And as Megan said, you know, there are things that we think of in quote as negative, like gossip, that actually have a positive impact in terms of teaching social skills. And getting back to the point about teaching kids to be like everybody else versus individual, well, there is a sense of fitting in that people are going to have to do if they want to have friends. Whether it's right or wrong, we live in a society where there are certain parts, as I say, of the social contract we all accept that we have to do to be part of the society. And again, people on the autism spectrum and with other disabilities generally want friends, want romantic partners, as Megan said, want to have jobs and be self-sufficient. But there are certain skills you have to learn socially to be able to go on a job interview, to work in an environment when you're not in COVID with other people, to learn appropriate dating skills. Like a lot of young men who are teenagers and young adults on the spectrum don't know those dating skills. We have to teach men that it's okay to say to a girl, you have pretty eyes. It's not okay to say you have pretty breasts. Generally.
Right. Generally. Yes, definitely.
You have to teach them that when you go on a job interview, you know, even if you think the guy's a jerk, you can't tell him that. If you think he's doing his job wrong or running his company wrong, you can't tell him that. And we have to teach them that, you know, when you work in an office environment, there are accommodations you're going to have to make and they're going to have to make. If somebody's, I don't know, taking all the coffee from the coffee room, I'm not a coffee drinker, so I don't have to worry about this. Coffee from the coffee room, an appropriate answer would be to have a civil discussion, not to scream who the hell is taking all the coffee. So you have to be mindful of the social contract that we all live in. And I think in particular right now, we're in a time in society where, with COVID, people are in such isolation that humans as a whole are forgetting some of that social contract. Not forgetting, but it's becoming less of a thing because we're all in our little bubbles. But I think that, part of living in society is accepting the social contract. And I've said this to someone recently with all the debate about wearing masks in public. Wearing a mask now is part of the social contract. It's the same as you wearing a shirt or pants. You can't go out on the street naked. Well, now you can't go out in public without a mask. It's the same part of that social contract we all learn as part of living in a society if we want to be able to be interdependent with others. If you want to be in your home and be a hermit and have food delivered and not have to ever leave your house, you're free to do that. It's just that most people don't actually want that life.
Right, absolutely. So then kind of diving into the impact of COVID-19 on social emotional learning, which might be a huge topic of discussion with our community. So COVID-19 has had dramatic impacts on social interactions for all of us, whether we're children or adults, whether we have special needs or we don't, right? So at the very minimum, it has redefined social rules entirely, right? So you can no longer just walk up to somebody and shake their hand. You can no longer jump into an elevator that's crowded with people. So at the very minimum, children who were socially successful before have now had to learn an entirely new set of rules very, very, very quickly. Now, for our children who were struggling socially already, that is even more challenging, right? Because they were struggling to learn the rules at first, and now we've spent all this time trying to teach them, and all of a sudden the rules have gone out the window. So if you have labored for years over teaching your children greetings, and now the rules of greetings are different because you better stand 6 feet away and you better wave instead of shaking a hand, right? And not that little kids shake hands, but that's just a silly example. That's changed dramatically.
Thank you. Well, Nick, you're right. And I just want to touch that quickly on what you were saying. We teach kids about appropriate social interactions.
Right.
A shaking of a hand, maybe not when they're very young, hugging a person. We
Right.
have to all be conscious now, even if it's a friend you haven't seen in a long time, you can't just go up and hug them.
Right. Exactly. And little kids, gosh, it's hard, right, when they're 5 because they really do want to hug each other. And that's challenging. So that's kind of the most mild end of the spectrum. At the most severe end of the spectrum, we are now supporting kids who have a new kind of anxiety, who may have had social anxiety before and now are terrified of people, because the world in which they live is one in which interacting with people could mean that you get really, really sick, or that someone you love dies, right? And these are the sort of the catastrophic thought patterns that some of our kids now have, whether they're true or not, right? Whether they've experienced loss, whether they've gotten sick, these are the thought patterns they now have. So at the most mild end, you've got kids who now have to relearn social rules. Some of those kids, that's particularly challenging because they struggled socially from the start. And some of our kids are now literally afraid of people and living in isolation because they don't have access to other people and they have this new type of anxiety. And as a result, social emotional learning has become critically more important, both in the school and outside of school.
And I think, Megan, one problem with that is also, as you said, they have to learn a whole new set of rules, but ideally, we hope, these are not going to be rules forever.
Right.
But a year and a half from now, it will go back to the old rules where you can shake hands, you can hug, you don't have to stand 6 feet apart, you don't have to wear a mask.
Right, absolutely. And the way that so there's this constant pivoting that needs to happen, right? Which is really fun when you're working with kids who are routine governed and learned those routines. Then you also have this idea of, okay, now how do we teach social learning when you're not necessarily in person, right? And we've had so many families come to us saying things like, hey, listen, my school has said that they can't do social skills instruction anymore because they can't play games at school, or they can't be close to people anymore, or they're on the computer so they can't do groups, or what have you, all of these different reasons. You guys, it is possible. It requires thought, it requires planning, it requires creativity, but we have done everything from transform hide and seek, right, which used to be a game that would no longer fly in a COVID world, to a totally socially acceptable game in the world of COVID by changing the rules. By making it a game in which you, instead of running up and tagging someone when you find them, you call from 6 feet away, hey, I found you, you're behind the tree. So there are strategies you can utilize to either change the way we teach or be creative in the way we teach that still allow us the opportunity to provide meaningful, effective instruction, whether it's through the computer or whether it's in person, to even some of our most complex kids. We have kids who have no verbal communication system yet and are benefiting from a telehealth social skills model and are making great progress. So it is possible. 2 resources for you on this front. I believe there's 2 of them. We have a free webinar on our website, so www.thehangoutspotllc.com. One of them is about long distance hangouts. So that's a really cool one about how you can facilitate social interactions with kids, either in person from a safe social distance or through virtual modalities with a little bit of creativity added. So that's a great one. And I was going to mention another one, but now I forget what it is. But check out the website. There's some really cool free resources there that may help give some ideas. And then Michael, I'll turn it back over to you. And if you want to touch on the legal perspective as well.
And speaking as well, I have some resources and links to some sites on my website, www.michaelgilbergesq.com. That's MICHAELGILBERGESQ.com. And we should provide all our information at the end. But legal, as I said before, school districts are required to look at the supposed social emotional learning, not just academic. You know, I very often see cases where schools will say, but he's getting A's and B's, everything's fine, his academics are fine. He doesn't need these services. But they ignore the fact that the IDEA, again, the federal law, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, requires schools to address social emotional needs, not just the academic needs. And again, special education is not just academics. You can be the most academically astute student in the world, get good grades. If you don't know how to deal with people, you're not going to find friends, you're not going to find a job, you're not going to find a significant other.
Yeah.
This is a huge issue that schools often overlook. I have cases over and over where the child is struggling emotionally. The kid says, I'm depressed, I want to kill myself. And the school's like, oh, he's fine, he has friends, because they see it as, well, the child is having a social interaction, but they don't assess whether it's a social interaction that they view as a positive or a proper social interaction, or they'll measure something as a social interaction because the child says, I need to get by, you're in my way, but it's not necessarily a meaningful interaction. And so we have to be mindful that schools very often, and I don't want to paint all schools, but this is where lawyers like me, I get the cases where these are issues. Schools are very often will say the child has friends, but it's not really a friendship, it's an acquaintance. It's somebody they're friendly with in school, but they don't have play dates. They don't, again, in non-COVID times, outside of school. And one thing now that schools are struggling with is that social piece for children who need it during COVID, because children can't go out socially interact outside of school. And so these are skills that are going to, in many kids, deteriorate over the past year and the next 6 to 8 months. And so we have to be mindful that from a legal perspective, there might be compensatory services needed later to make up these social deficits. Schools can't, and parents often don't realize, schools can be made to pay under the IDEA for social skills groups, therapy, and other interventions, services from groups like Meghan's group, the Hangout Spot, to facilitate these social relationships, things that either the school is unwilling or unable to do, or in many cases, compensatory services are required and there are not enough hours in the school day to do them.
Great, thanks, Michael. So before we kind of conclude, Michael, I did put my contact information in the chat if you want to put yours in there as well. Before we kind of conclude, does anyone have any questions, any particular topics we didn't cover here today that you'd like to learn more about? I'm sure Michael is as well. We're both really passionate about these topics and happy to talk to you more offline if you have specific questions that you're interested in learning more about. But we'll kind of open up the chat at this point to see if anyone had anything they'd like to ask at this point. You're welcome to
Megan,
chat.
I agree. I want to add one other point.
Sure.
Living in the world of COVID that we are now, I'm also observing that a lot of children are having difficulty with distance learning, children with social deficits who don't know how to function on Zoom or Google Meet or whatever platform we're using. And it is becoming an issue that is affecting their social skills, their interactions, and making them regress both academically and emotionally. That will be coming down the pipe in the next few months as we eventually transition back to what we hope is a normal world.
Right. That's actually a really good point, Michael. So one of our surprising areas of expertise these days that we never anticipated working on, we are doing a lot of work with kids who have been burnt by distance learning. So I should frame this for you all. We offer both in-person services out of an office here or a center here in Norwalk. I'm sitting in one of our playrooms here, but we do in-person, but we also do virtual programming. We do virtual developmental playgroups, virtual social skills classes, and virtual family coaching. And quite a few of our kids have come to us simply because they have experienced horrific distance learning experiences. And as a result, we have a child who now every time the computer comes out runs the other direction or verbally protests or what have you, all of these different things. And that's not because the child can't access it, right? So we even have children who don't have joint attention skills and don't have verbal communication skills who are now able to access distance learning because we taught it the right way. We made it fun. We pulled out the burp buttons. We pulled out the animal videos. We pulled out Among Us, and we used those things to teach the child how to find distance learning to be fun and something they wanted to be a part of. And then we slowly and systematically teach things like, hey, sometimes we got to do things we don't want to do. So a lot of our kids right now are participating in our programs as a means to fix some of that bad distance learning that happened and teach them the skills that they need to access a remote learning program at this time. So if that's something you need help with, I'm happy to talk to you more about that. And we've got some free resources available on that as well. So
question.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if the chat is visible on the recording later or not because I'm still learning Zoom.
That's okay.
Go ahead. I would like a general overview from Michael of the extent to which maladaptive behaviors result in disciplinary proceedings or manifestation determinations. Difficult question. I mean, the answer is behaviors, whether they result in disciplinary proceedings, really becomes a matter for the individual school to decide. There's no way to say a universal rule. Every school makes a decision, but the goal is for the school to teach those skills in a way that the student won't end up in disciplinary proceedings. The follow-up is local practices. As Megan said earlier, we can't talk specifically about a specific case or specific school district here. I can only give you general answers. I can talk to people later offline about specific cases. But the idea is, with a maladaptive behavior, is trying to figure out why that maladaptive behavior is occurring and eliminating it so the child doesn't end up in disciplinary proceedings. In cases I've seen, the child is behaving poorly and the school will say, well, there's a disciplinary proceeding. Let's throw the child into not the right environment because we don't know what to do with them, instead of just looking at why the behavior is occurring and what's triggering it and what they can do to change that.
That's a good question, Sarah. I mean, and I know nothing about the legal world, but something I think about from a behavioral perspective is, and I see this all the time, right? So I actually was a public school employee for quite some time before this, and the kind of knee-jerk reaction I would often see, not all the time, but often, was if a child was engaging in problem behaviors, they should be sent to detention. They should be suspended. They should be punished in some way. And rather than, and schools, that's traditional behavior management, right? I mean, that's what schools just have always done since the beginning of school's time. But when in reality, what we need to be doing is what we talked about before, figuring out what the barriers are and figuring out what we need to teach the child what to do instead. So the process we go through for that is something called a functional behavior assessment, where we really figure out what function is the behavior serving and how can we teach the child what to do instead. Now, that's not always the knee-jerk reaction, right, on the part of schools that sometimes will resort to more traditional methods. But from a ethical perspective and from a teaching perspective, that should be our knee-jerk reaction. So if that's something you're struggling with your school-based team and you haven't had the opportunity to work through a functional behavior assessment process, that might be something worth exploring. You know, again, defer to your individual providers, but that might be something to look into, and I'd be happy to kind of chat with you offline a little bit more about that if that would be helpful.
Right, as Megan said, I think that, the question is, why is the behavior occurring? We have to move from a model of punitive consequences for behavior to looking at the why and how do we replace the behavior.
Right.
Very often the behavior is to mask something else.
Right, absolutely. And Sarah, this is a good question. How do you get districts to collaborate on FBAs and VIPs and whether they're willing to partnership on generalizing skills? So it's a hard answer. When I do this, so again, and I have perspective of being an in-school provider. So I was a special education teacher as well as a board certified behavior analyst in a public school setting. And those are all things that I kind of experienced, right? So how do you collaborate with outside providers? How do you collaborate with families? One of the things I would suggest is to find a way to develop rapport with your school team the best you can. And I know that seems like such a silly answer, but the way that I found I get the most buy-in from people when I'm looking to collaborate and work on generalization across environments is if I have a really strong rapport and that the school team doesn't feel like I'm coming in and telling them what to do. That tends to be the perspective when you have outside providers, right? Is, well, I feel like my opinion isn't valued. And I feel like, I feel like you're coming in directing me, even though I know the child very well. And that can be frustrating for school team members. So doing what we can to get to know people, to really use collaborative language, to build that rapport, sometimes that increases the likelihood that they'll be willing to collaborate. And I find that strategy to be pretty effective. We do have a free resource available. If you'd like it, feel free to shoot me an email about kind of how to increase communication and collaboration with school teams and get to that place using some unique applied behavior analysis strategies. So I'm happy to share that with you if that would be helpful. Any other questions?
And I just also want to mention with what Megan was saying that, there is always, very often it does take attorneys like myself or advocates to get outside providers working with the school district. And unfortunately, in many cases, the decisions for school districts are not being made by the teachers or the people who work with the students, but being made by administrators where there are financial concerns involved.
Right. Always complicates things for sure.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, I'm not seeing any. Oh, one more. Also interested in how much you get to collaborate with districts on FBA and VIPs and whether that's absolutely my personal, sorry, I can't read fast enough, Sarah. That's absolutely my personal philosophy too. You're so welcome, Sarah. I'm glad that's so helpful. And guys, if you have other questions or things you want to talk to, Michael and I are both available. We really appreciate you guys joining today. This was a fun discussion. We hope you took something away from it, that there's some piece of information here that was helpful to you guys. We will be sending out the recording to everybody who emailed us to register, but if for some reason you don't get it, let us know at our email addresses, which we dropped in the chat, because we are more than happy to share it with you. And we will be posting it on our websites as well. So if you'd like to download it from there, that's an option. And thank you guys so much. We will talk to you all soon and have a wonderful winter season and stay safe.
Thank you all. It was great to talk to you. If you need to reach us, our information is in the chat. You can find it online very easily. Thank you all for attending.
Great. Thanks, everybody.